Right now, somewhere on Earth, an elderly woman is babysitting her grandchildren. It seems completely ordinary. It is not. That woman, and every grandmother before her for the past 100,000 years, is the reason you are alive. Not your parents, not your ancestors who hunted, not the strongest or the fastest, the grandmothers. This is the story of how a biological accident turned old women into the most important survival technology our species ever produced, and why, without them, humans would have probably gone extinct. Here is the problem. In almost every species on Earth, females reproduce until they die. A female chimpanzee, a female elephant, a female wolf. They stay fertile their entire lives. When they stop reproducing, they die, usually very quickly. Evolution is brutal and simple. If you cannot make offspring, you are biologically useless. That is the rule. Humans broke it. Human women stop reproducing decades before they die. Menopause, a complete shutdown of fertility, usually around age 50. And then they keep living for another 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. No other primate does this. Almost no mammal does this. The question that kept evolutionary biologists awake for decades is a simple one. Why would evolution allow this? Why would natural selection keep a creature alive long after it stops reproducing? If evolution only cares about passing on genes, grandmothers should not exist. And yet, here we are. For most of history, scientists assumed menopause was simply a mistake, a side effect of living longer than evolution expected. Early humans were not supposed to live past 40, the thinking went, so menopause was irrelevant. The problem with that explanation is the evidence. Studies of hunter-gatherer groups, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Kung in southern Africa, the Agta in the Philippines show something consistent. Women in these societies frequently live well into their 60s and 70s. They lived long lives, and those extra years were not quiet years. They were working years. Which made researchers ask a different question entirely. What exactly were grandmothers doing with all that time? Imagine a hunter-gatherer camp, somewhere in Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago. A mother has just given birth to her third child. She is exhausted. Her body is depleted. The newborn needs constant feeding. But she has two other children who are still too young to feed themselves. A 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. In almost any other primate species, this is a crisis. Chimpanzee mothers space their births about 5 years apart, specifically because they cannot care for two dependent young at the same time. Human mothers, for reasons no one fully understands, have babies much closer together, sometimes just 2 years apart. Biologically, this should not work. A nursing mother cannot gather enough calories for herself, feed two toddlers, and care for a newborn simultaneously. The math does not add up. Except in camp, behind the mother, is her own mother. The grandmother is not resting. She is digging tubers from the hard ground, carrying roots back to camp, preparing food for the older children, freeing the mother to focus entirely on the newborn. The math suddenly works. This was not charity. This was survival engineering. In 1997, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes published a paper that changed how scientists understood human evolution. It was called the grandmother hypothesis. Hawkes had spent years studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. she noticed something that no one had properly documented before. Postmenopausal women in Hadza camps were the hardest workers of anyone. They foraged more hours per day than anyone else. They brought home more food per hour than the younger women. And critically, children whose grandmothers were present in camp were measurably better nourished than children without grandmothers nearby. The grandmother was not a burden on the group. She was the group's most productive member. Hawks ran the numbers. If grandmothers increased child survival rates even slightly by helping mothers wean children earlier, by feeding older siblings, by freeing mothers to become pregnant again sooner, the effect over thousands of generations would be enormous. Grandmothers allowed human birth spacing to compress. More births, more surviving children, more genetic descendants. The genes of women who lived longer after menopause spread through the population because their grandchildren survived at higher rates. Over tens of thousands of years, human lifespans extended, not because of better food or less disease, but because grandmothers were useful enough that evolution rewarded longevity. We did not get long lives and then discover grandmothers were helpful. We got long lives because grandmothers were helpful. Evolution extended the human lifespan specifically to keep grandmothers alive and working. But food was only part of it. Grandmothers did something that no other family member could do in the same way. They remembered. In a world without writing, without books, without any form of recorded information, the oldest members of a group were the library. They remembered the drought that came 30 years ago. They knew which plants were safe when the usual ones failed. They remembered migration routes. They knew which animals behaved strangely before a storm. A grandmother who had survived 60 years of unpredictable conditions was carrying information that could not be replaced. Researchers studying elephant populations, another species with long post-reproductive lifespans, found direct evidence of this. In a 2008 study, herds led by older matriarchs responded more effectively to threats. They knew to recognize the calls of lions they had encountered decades earlier. Younger group members without that knowledge made worse decisions. The oldest females were not slowing the group down. They were the group's threat detection system. Humans almost certainly worked the same way. A grandmother who remembered the last time a particular river flooded, or which neighbor tribe had attacked 40 years ago, or what the sky looked like before the worst storm she had ever seen, that knowledge kept people alive. Long life was not just about feeding grandchildren. It was about carrying the past into the future. Here is the number that should stop you completely. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have a birth catalogue of roughly 5 years. They wait 5 years between babies because a chimpanzee mother cannot support 2 dependent young at once. Human birth intervals in hunter-gatherer societies average around 3 years, sometimes 2. That difference, 2 or 3 years between babies instead of 5, compounded over thousands of generations, is the difference between a small, struggling species clinging to survival and a population of 8 billion people covering every continent on Earth. That compression was made possible by one thing: grandmothers picking up the load. The human population explosion, the entire trajectory of human civilization, was built on the labor of old women digging roots. Nobody put that in the history books. There is a woman in your family, maybe still alive, maybe not. She is probably not celebrated for saving civilization. She probably spent her days doing things that looked ordinary, cooking, watching children, remembering things nobody thought to write down. But the grandmother hypothesis says something uncomfortable and precise. Every human alive today, every person walking this planet, is here partly because of the work of postmenopausal women who lived long after evolution had no strict biological reason to keep them alive. They were kept alive because they were too useful to lose. And in keeping them alive, evolution accidentally created something it never planned. A species with grandmothers, which turned out to be the most powerful survival advantage we ever had. More than weapons, more than fire, more than language. The person who may have had the single largest impact on whether your family line survived probably never hunted anything. She just never stopped working, and she remembered everything.